the way I would describe my major research program is what I've called the membership's theory of inequality. And that somewhat pretentious phrase refers to the idea that in thinking about inequality, both cross-sectionally and across generations, that one of the fundamental mechanisms, not a theory of everything, but one of the important explanations has to do with social factors. So what I mean by that is that there's sort of three ideas I'd put on the table, and in some ways, much of my research is just efforts to elaborate those ideas. One of them is a simple, I will say, is the argument that in thinking about individual choices, that the constituents of those choices include social factors. And so in economics, the logic of choice is driven by the interaction of preferences, constraints, and beliefs. And so this type of approach to understanding choices would say that each of the three has a social component. So to play that out, there's an aspect of my preferences, the way I prefer to do A or B, that may have to do with my desire to conform to the behavior of my friends. That doesn't sound like a crazy way to think about teenagers, for example. Similarly, the opportunities that I face are going to be functions of the individuals with whom I interact and the information flows that move from them to me and from me to them. And similarly, the way I think about the world, my beliefs about the consequences of actions. Again, in the context of adolescence, one can think about the payoff to hard work in high school. All of those they have social influences. And so at that level, I think that nobody would find that in the slightest bit objectionable. What is interesting from the perspective of thinking about inequality, or in general in economics, is that when these interrelationships have a particular structure, they have very powerful consequences. And so there, the key idea is going to be complementarity, which is a formalization of the idea that incentives exist for me to behave similarly to others, either because I wish to conform to them or because my observation of their behavior leads me to draw similar conclusions about what I ought to do, or because the constraints associated with their behavior constrain me as well. And complementarity in turn becomes a very powerful idea because it explains why there can be correlations in behavior between people that are linked to each other in a social structure. And so to move from a very simple explanation to big picture types of phenomena, the sort of idea that's in the complement, or the sort of implication of complementarity one would end up with is an explanation as to why different ethnic groups, why different genders could exhibit substantial heterogeneity in smoking rates. So put differently, the introduction of these social factors, when it's done through the particular formalism of this type of interdependence, which I call complementarity, becomes a theory of group level inequality. And much of my own work has had to do with elaborating environments in which one has the neoclassical logic of choice driven by preferences, constraints, and beliefs, but enriches their determinants in ways that situates people in a social environment. One of the things that can happen in such worlds is that one can have what are called multiple equilibria, which is a fancy way of saying that if one describes individuals, you actually don't know what they're going to collectively do. They may do one thing or they may do another. And so if you think about conformity effects, that almost is like a degree of freedom in how people behave. In other words, if people are very conforming to one another, that tells you they'll behave similarly, but it doesn't tell you what they're going to do. So that would be the way in which one translates the abstraction of the formal theory into substantive implications. A second aspect of the theory, of the membership's theory, has to do with the way in which social structures form. And so if I make an argument that role models matter for kids, or peers matter for kids, I've actually implicitly made an argument that we would expect parents to make choices of the locations in which their kids grow up that respect or account for the presence of these influences. And so, much more generally, when people have socially determined aspects of choice, in turn, to the extent that they can, they're going to wish to influence these social environments in which they function. And what that typically means in these environments is that complementarity or social interactions, which is my preferred term for this class of ideas, they produce incentives for segregation. And so in understanding the degree to which neighborhoods stratify by income, one of the factors, or one way to think about that, is going to be that families wish to have neighbors that will have positive tax base effects, that will have kids that are educationally motivated, and I could go on with a whole litany of these types of social influences. And so the broad idea then is to try to understand how the social or the interactive nature of different environments creates incentives for segregation. And that leads to the third aspect of the theory, which is if one makes an argument that there are forces that promote segregation that are coexisting with these strong social influences, that actually becomes a theory of intergenerational immobility. And so metaphorically, the way that I think about many phenomena is that cross-sectional inequality enhances or creates segregation. Segregation creates disparities in the life courses of children, and those disparities in turn translate or transmit the socioeconomic status of the parents to the children. Now, clearly, there's many ways in which socioeconomic status of parents transmits to children. So the classical models of intergenerational mobility, pioneered by Gary Becker, would emphasize direct family investments. The parents invest directly in their children. The complementary, in another sense, view here that I'm taking is that what parents also do is they shape the social environments, subject to constraints, that children experience, and that's another way in which the parent's socioeconomic status determines the neighborhoods in which one grows up, the schools that one attends, possibly the colleges one enrolls in, and that, as a consequence, becomes a transmission mechanism. Now, the membership's theories have many different facets to them. One aspect of this perspective would emphasize the role of college admissions rules in explaining inequality. There's nothing sacrosanct about a rule that says that this school has to set thresholds for test scores or grades, or whether or not it accounts for diversity. And so, just to give a little bit of a side direction, one can think about from the perspective of peer effects in schools, which are not just necessarily simply the interactions of students one-on-one, but also the implications for types of students for how teaching is done at a university. One can think again about the membership's theory as a vantage point about the role of higher education in determining levels of inequality and intergenerational mobility. My own work, as I said, much of it can be organized in some sense as trying to elucidate aspects of this type of work. I am myself primarily a methodologist, by which I mean that my own research focuses on two aspects of the formalization. One is to write down general equilibrium models of environments with social influences, and the idea would be to ask how it is when one specifies individual decision-making rules and the rules by which individuals interact, which are just a jargon for whether there are markets, what sort of game theoretic solution concepts are appropriate depending on the environment, and ask what the aggregate consequences are. A second area that I've worked has to do with understanding the relationship between the theoretical models and data, and that's the so-called identification problem. If one has data on individual behaviors, under what circumstances can one determine the respective roles of family-specific influences versus social influences and the like? And so the objective in much of my research is to understand both the equilibrium consequences of these of social influence, as well as to understand to what extent empirical analysis can reveal their distinct role.